All right, thanks, Rob. Wow, he covered a lot of information here. And some of the ingredients that he talked about, I'm going to be doing in this next presentation. And then when I finish, we'll have a 15-minute break. So if you can bear with us a little bit longer before our break starts. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the precursor chemicals and chemicals that are used in making chemical weapons as well as some explosives. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So one of the things I'm hoping as I go through these presentations is to provide you some resources and tools to identify some of these chemicals of concern, and specifically some of the chemicals with the greatest potential that could be used in the manufacturing of chemical weapons. Let's go to the next slide. So as we talked about yesterday, there's several different categories of chemicals of concern. The most dangerous category is the nerve agents. You can see the first one there. Those include things like SOMAN, sarin, tauberin, and VX. These directly affect your body's ability to send signals, which can control your movements. We're going to talk more about each one of these as we go through the presentation. Then we have the blister agents. These have been around for a very long time, the sulfur mustard and the nitrogen mustard and lewisite. What the blister agents do is once you get them on your skin, they start to create large blisters, particularly areas that could be moist, like between your fingers, under your arms, anywhere you'd have contact with these blister agents are going to cause very painful and dangerous blisters. The next category we have are the blood agents, like cyanide, hydrogen cyanide, and cyanogen chloride. What the blood agents do, these cyanides will attach to your red blood cells, and they will not allow your blood to carry oxygen. Basically, you will suffocate to death from cyanide poisoning. Next, we have the choking agents. We have the chlorine and phosgene gas. Again, these affect your eyes, your skin, and will get into your lungs, extremely irritating. Then we have a different category called the incapacitating agents. These are typically pharmaceutical based. BZ was invented in the 1940s in the US. It was actually designed to be a pharmaceutical, and it turned out to very much incapacitate people, and it was used as a chemical weapon. Some of the other chemicals susceptible to misuse include some pharmaceuticals. We talked about the toxic industrial chemicals. And then we also have agricultural chemicals and riot control. If you look at the pictures on the bottom of the screen, the far two to your right are both from World War II, and this is chlorine gas attacks. The first picture you see on your left, that is US troops learning to use protective chemical gear against chemical gases. Let's go on to the next slide. So there's a lot of problems with identifying chemicals. This can be extremely difficult because many of these chemicals are colorless, or they're white powders, several solids, there's gases, yellow liquids. What they look like very rarely identifies what the chemical is and its hazards. The last thing you want to do is open a container and try to smell it or touch it to try to identify what it is. So let's go ahead and do click again. Let's bring the other ones up. The best way to identify a chemical is by the labels on the container. If you see in shipping chemical containers that have had the labels removed, scratched out, or appear to have been damaged, that could be a warning sign that someone is trying to hide what that chemical is. The second way to identify a chemical is by laboratory analysis. This can be very slow and very expensive to try to identify exactly what it is through laboratory analysis. So let's go to the next slide. And we had those two chemicals, the powders that you saw. Here we have the first and the second. And can we go ahead and identify which of these two solids, just by looking at it, would be hazardous? So go ahead and enter that in your Menti. All right, looks like we had 17 people answer, and looks like the numbers are pretty close to being the same here. Actually, number one, that is salt, just regular sea salt. So it's not hazardous. Number two is actually sodium cyanide. If everyone remembers the James Bond movies when they would bite the little capsule and someone would die, that would have sodium cyanide in it. So you can tell identifying chemicals by what they look like really is very difficult to do. Let's go on to the next slide. So chemicals come in many different types of containers. The first example we have, you can see there's an aluminum tote, which is containing phosphorus pentasulfide. If you look, there's a label on it. It has diamond labels with the UN number 1340. It says it's flammable if you get it wet, and it's also a solid material inside that's flammable. That's what the two diamonds mean. The picture in the center is a barrel with a plastic liner. Just by looking at that, we can't tell what it is, but it's actually containing HMX, which is a high explosive in that drum. The picture on the far right, on the top, this would be a laboratory-sized bottle that you could find in any university or medical school, colleges, high schools that have chemistry labs would have these type of containers. There's quite a bit of markings on there. If you notice, there's the chemical name. There's also the chemical structure, how much it contains, a little bit of information on it being dangerous, and a few other numbers available. On the bottom left side, we have a very large seagoing container. Although the picture is not clear, it also has UN numbers on it. If you could read those UN numbers in placarding, you would see that this is sodium cyanide. Again, very toxic, dangerous chemical. The picture in the middle on the bottom is also a small laboratory bottle, and that contains phosphorus oxychloride, which is also very hazardous. If you look, it's clear. It looks like it could be water. And then the powder that looks like salt on the bottom is actually hafnium powder. So you can see without the labels, it's very difficult to tell what the chemical is. Let's go to the next slide. So there are some useful markings to help you identify chemicals. First is the chemical name. Now, this can be difficult because the same chemical can have multiple different names. If you see the first one there is thiodiglycol, it's also called thiodiphenol and 2-hydroxy disulfide. It's all the same chemical. That makes using names somewhat difficult. Another difficult issue with chemical names is the spelling. The spelling is very important. Every letter is very important. If you transpose or get the spelling wrong, it could be a completely different chemical. Especially when you're working in foreign languages, this becomes extremely difficult. Now, there's another system called the Chemical Abstract Services. This is a United States company that decided we have to have a better way. What they do, they came up with a numbering system. And this is their secret. They use a very special mathematical formula. So there's no way to come up with fake CAS numbers. If you see the X's, each X represents a digit, and it can be anything between 0 to 9. You'll see there's a series of X's followed by a dash with 2 numbers and a dash with 1. When you see that format, you'll know that you have a CAS number. So you can see the number for thiodiglycol is 111488. If you used your phone and you went to Google or you just typed in those numbers, chances are you're going to pull up that chemical. The next way to identify chemicals is well known to customs people is the HS system, the harmonized system. Very familiar to customs officials and licensing. The problem is that number is often not unique. You can see thiodiglycol, the number for that, which is actually listed as an organosulfur compound. It doesn't tell you exactly what the chemical is. The last category, I think you can click it once more, is the UN number. So the United Nations came up with a numbering system which was actually designed for shipping of hazardous chemicals. The UN numbers is 4 digits long. It might say UN and then the 4 digits or just 4 digits. This would be on the outside of large cargo containers, rail cars, trains, you'll see these numbers. One of the problems is a lot of the time, the UN number is not unique. UN numbers are often for families of chemicals, things like flammable solid, flammable liquid, flammable gas, toxic gas. So that will make it kind of difficult for the chemicals that do not have specific UN numbers. Let's do a quick poll on the next page. Oh, sorry, I have one more slide. All right. The CAS numbers are on labels. Here we have that small laboratory-sized chemical bottle. And if you notice in the upper right-hand corner, there is that series of digits. Everyone can see 756 with the -79 and the -6. Look for that pattern. There is your CAS number. So this container also has the chemical name as well as the CAS number on it. A couple years ago, several of us went to CAS's facility and saw how they create the numbers and all the chemicals registration systems that they do. I can't even remember. It's somewhere they're adding around 7,000 to 10,000 new chemicals to their registry every single day. So it is the most comprehensive collection of chemicals is through the CAS system. Okay, now let's go to the next one. All right, we have a Menti poll. So looking at these labels, you can see we have a bunch of different numbers on here. Yep, I can see. All right. It looks like everyone is doing a really good job of paying attention as to the format of what CAS numbers look like. And the important thing here is to remember that sequence, a series of digits, a dash, 2 digits, a dash, and 1 digit. Very easy to identify a chemical that way versus using the name or the chemical structure. So all you would have to do is type those numbers in on your phone in a like a Google search, and you'll come up with what that chemical is. All right, let's go to the next one. So where else could we find CAS numbers? Every chemical that's shipped has to be shipped with safety data sheets. This provides information if there's a spill, a leak, who manufactured the chemical, what to do if someone's exposed, that type of thing. You can see in the very top section of safety data sheets, it lists the CAS number. Right there, you can see in the box, the CAS number for it, also the manufacturer, and some of the precautionary label. Again, this rule went into effect about 10 years ago. Every chemical that's shipped has to ship with a safety data sheet. In large containers, there could be some paperwork attached to the outside or inside boxes that would be carrying the chemicals. Okay, let's go to the next one. CAS numbers can also be found on product specification sheets. The specification sheets will tell you the ingredients, what's in it, the percentage of each chemical as well. You can see right there, we have trithanolamine. There's the CAS numbers right on the top. Okay, let's go to the next sheet. Next, we have the UN numbers. Again, we said UN numbers are on the outsides of large bulk containers, trucks, rail cars. Anytime there's a large bulk shipment, it will have the UN number. Again, this has to do with the hazards dealing with shipping. There's also a UN hazards declaration. Those you can identify by the red striped line down the side of the paper. The very first column calls out the UN number, and then we have the proper shipping name. So here we have 1385, which is sodium sulfide. And then next we have the hazard class. Remember, the primary purpose of UN numbers is to identify the hazard class of the chemical. Okay, let's go to the next one. Next, we have the HS, or Harmonized Code System. This is typically found on shipping documents. These would be very well known by those of you that are working in customs offices. You are very familiar with HS codes. Some of the chemicals can be identified based on 6 digits of the HS code. You can see an example here of the HS codes for some of the different chemicals. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So yesterday, Heidi had put in your files copies of these books. I have this here, the chemical cross-reference. So several of our coworkers have done a lot of work taking controlled chemicals and breaking them down by different means. You all have copies of this handbook now, and also the main chemical cross-reference. Both of these were in your files. So the class that you do in the afternoon is going to be working from this book. And we made a special book just for the Saberni chemicals, which is in this version. This book includes chemical weapon agents, the precursors, some of riot control agents, toxic industrial chemicals, explosives, and some of the chemicals you need to manufacture explosives, and then chemicals of concern for actually enriching nuclear materials, delivery systems, such as rocket fuels and military application chemicals. The chemicals that are listed in these books come from existing national and international control lists to put this together. So let's go to the next slide. Where else can you get information on controlled chemicals? Here's a list. The Chemical Weapons Convention, they have a schedule of chemicals. There's their website, the OPCW. The Australia group, or the AG, they list chemical weapon precursors. And then we have Wassenaar, which has the munitions list, which also covers some of the dual-use chemicals. And in the United States has the OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They put together the toxic industrial chemical list that we've been talking about as well. And then there's also the European Parliament list, which has a council and identification markings of explosive precursor chemicals. So these are all different sources that you can go to get information on controlled chemicals. Let's go to the next slide. So in our little book, hopefully some of you were able to download this last night and have a printout of it. What we've done is identified the chemicals based on their concern. So you can see in the first column, we have toxic industrial chemicals that have a high level of concern. These are very toxic industrial use chemicals that in small quantities could be used by a terrorist group. Next, we have the toxic industrial chemicals of medium concern. Again, it's going to take larger amounts of these chemicals to cause some kind of a terrorist attack. Then we have the low toxic industrial chemicals of low concern. However, even if it's marked as low concern, these are still very dangerous chemicals. So if someone has these, they could use these to cause quite a bit of problems, even if they released some of the low-level ones. Then we have the most toxic, are marked as chemical weapon agents. These are the chemical weapons themselves. We have the precursors for manufacturing of chemical weapons, basically the ingredients. Next, we have explosive materials that we talked a little bit about earlier. Delivery system. These are chemicals that would be used in manufacturing of different types of rocket fuel. We have the military and explosive chemicals, the riot control agents, and then also the last category, chemicals that are related to the manufacture of enriching uranium and building nuclear weapons. So each one of these categories, as you'll see as we go through it, are listed inside of this book. Let's go to the next slide. So our book here is broken up into several different categories. It is the same information in each category, but it's arranged differently. So our first category, we're listing chemicals by the CAS number. You can see the very first column there has the CAS numbers in order from smallest to largest. The second column lists the standard chemical name. And the third column is the concern. Is it a toxic industrial chemical? You can see the second one is a chemical weapon agent, and so on. All of the chemicals in the first grouping here in group 1 are listed the same way. Let's go to the next slide. In the second category in the book, we've taken the same numbers, the same chemicals, and arranged them by UN number. So you can see The UN numbers, like I said, on the outside of cargo containers, rail cars, large trucks. If you see a UN number on it and it's in this book, you know you have a chemical of concern. So again, the second column is the standard chemical name. Next, we have the proper shipping name, the technical name for the chemical, and then also what is the concern with use of those chemicals. Okay, let's go to the next slide. We've taken this same category now and we've arranged it here by UN numbers. As you can see, the first column is some of the selected UN numbers that are of concern, and then the proper shipping names for those chemicals that also include export controlled chemicals. Let's go to the next section. And finally, we have the HS code section. We have listed some of the chemicals that have unique HS codes, as well as categories of chemicals below that would fall under that same number. So as you see, the 2811.19 is the same number for the last 4 chemicals on the list. They don't have a specific HS code for those. And then again, the final column shows what the concern is with the chemicals that are listed by HS code. Okay. So hopefully, if you have not downloaded the book yet, you'll find it in your material, and it's very useful, especially for customs and identifying chemicals fairly quickly. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay. The last category is by standard chemical name. If we don't have any other means to identify the chemical other than by its name, they are in order and by spelling. Second, we have what would be its CAS number, the HS code number, the UN number, and its concern. Sometimes manufacturers don't put CAS numbers or HS codes. They strictly put the standard chemical name on the package, and this category should help with that situation as well. Let's go to the next category. We're going to recognize some of the concerns with these chemicals that we're going to be going through. The important thing to remember is a lot of these precursors that are used, the ingredients in chemical weapons, have legitimate commercial uses. And they are sold very commonly and shipped in large containers. These chemicals could be choking agents, like we talked about the chlorine compounds, the blister agents, the nitrogen mustards, the sulfur mustards. We talked about blood agents, cyanide, and also the nerve compounds. Now what we're going to do is look at each one of these groupings individually. Let's go to the next slide. So the choking agents. Remember, we talked about these. You get these in your lungs. They're going to cause irritation to your eyes, your throat, and it's going to cause fluids to build up in your lungs. The 2 pictures you see at the top, these came out in the United States and in England around World War II. These posters were put up to help the population identify what they might smell like. So as you can see, phosgene smells something like musty hay or like freshly cut grass or corn. So we have 2 agents here of concern in the choking category. We have the chlorine agents. Remember, it's a yellow or greenish liquid or gas. In a fog, the gas will hang close to the ground, and it smells like bleach or like swimming pools. Again, chlorine is used very much in swimming pools and for water treatment. Phosgene is a white to yellow gas. Like we said, it can smell like grass, hay, or corn. Let's go to the next category. Next, we have the blood agents. We have the cyanide compounds. The German death camps in World War II actually used a cyanide-based agent for killing masses of people. You can see there's a picture of one of the old containers called Zyklon B. Again, we talked about the blood agents. They stop your blood's ability to carry oxygen. We have two categories here. We have cyanogen chloride. There you have the military markings, and hydrogen cyanide. The interesting thing about these cyanide compounds smell like almonds. And part of this, what's interesting, women can smell it much better than men can. So if you're opening a container, say a cargo container, and the women around say, I can smell almonds, I would be very concerned that it could be a cyanide-based compounds. All right, let's go to the next. Next, we have the blister agents. Here's two more posters that were made around World War II with some of the blister agents. Some of the symptoms include, we talked about blisters, damage to the eyes, very painful in the sinus tissues. Anywhere you have moist areas, mustard agents are very, very painful. We have several categories. Here, the second column, you can see the military designation. A lot of these, they look like motor oil. It's kind of a dark yellowish, thick oil. They're kind of greasy. The mustard agents smell like garlic or onions. And then the other agent, lewisite, is also oily, and it smells something like the flower called a geranium. Let's go to the next category. The nerve agents, we talked about these. These are the most toxic of all the categories. We have 4 different chemicals. Most of these were invented in Germany around World War II. Items like tauberin, sarin, soman, and VX. If everyone remembers, back in 2017, there was an actual terrorist use of VX. Everyone remembers the Kuala Lumpur airport when Kim Jong-nam was attacked, and they put a very small amount of VX on him. And there's security cameras. You can see how quickly that affected him. He started to drag his legs. It wasn't long at all before he actually died from VX poisoning. So all of these are extremely toxic, very, very dangerous chemicals. Let's go to the next slide. There's several different precursor chemicals that have to do with chemical weapons. And we're just going to go over some of these categories. It's important to know some of the industrial and commercial uses for these chemicals, because these are where these chemicals should be going. When we talked about totality of circumstances, when I would look at a chlorine agent, I would say, where is it going and what are they going to use it for, to see if it's a legitimate commercial use. So chlorine agents, again, they're used in choking, water treatment plants, pharmaceuticals, manufacturers of dyes for clothing, and also manufacturing of pesticides. Lots of chlorine for water treatment and manufacturing of pesticides. The cyanide compounds, mining and metallurgy. Anyone who's doing a lot of gold mining is going to be using cyanides. Also, anyone manufacturing of jewelry, gold plating, all of that is done with the use of cyanides. The blister agents, the nitrogen, sulfur, and arsenic compounds, lots of commercial uses. Manufacturing of plastics, rubbers, dyes, textiles, batteries, pharmaceuticals, oil additives, detergents, cosmetics, ceramics. So many uses for these nitrogen and sulfur and arsenic compounds. The fluorine compounds, almost every nerve agent has a phosphorus or fluorine-based compounds. Again, pesticides, flame retardants, lubricant additives, water treatments. Everyone brushes their teeth. Fluorine is actually the fluoride, which is added in to help protect your teeth. It's also used quite a bit in the semiconductor and plastic manufacturing. So you can see there's many uses, commercial uses for these chemicals. Next, we'll just look at the next slide quickly here. A little bit about some of the toxic industrial chemicals. We've talked about these quite a bit. These are large amount chemicals that are used in industrial uses. You will find very large containers being stored and transported worldwide. One of the programs that we do, we meet with industrial users of these chemicals and evaluate their storage to make sure gates are locked, valves are locked, to prevent people from coming in and trying to steal or release some of these toxic industrial chemicals. Let's go to the next slide. So currently, the OSHA listing has 21 chemicals that are considered hazardous toxic industrial chemicals. This is the list you can see of the 21 chemicals that are of concern. Okay, next slide. So we're going to look at just a few of these agents here. Chlorine, it's a yellowish green gas. If you look at the picture on the bottom, this is a rail car full of chlorine gas. This was in the US. They had connected up the piping to fill the rail car that you see, and the pipes broke. So you can see the chlorine gas is close to the ground. It's kind of a yellowish green. And there you have two emergency response workers in fully encapsulated suits, wearing breathing equipment, going in and trying to shut the valve from that chlorine gas leak. It's very hazardous. It can be a choking agent, like we talked about. It is a high hazard industrial chemical, and it's also very corrosive to electrical components. Any electrical equipment, switches, wiring, the chlorine will highly damage that wiring, making it unfunctional just from contact with that gas. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Here's some chlorine containers. I live very close to a water park, and they use chlorine gas to treat the water in the swimming pools. They have containers that look like you see in the picture, where they're bubbling the chlorine gas through the water to sanitize the water in the pools. You can see some of the larger cylinders, and there is also on the bottom a rail car of chlorine gas. You can see on the bottom, there's the CAS, the UN number, and HS code. You notice each one has its own specific number because it ships so widely and it's very toxic. Let's go to the next slide. Next, we have the cyanide categories. Again, we talked, these are very common uses in metallurgy and mining. The upper picture on the right side, we have some examples of sodium and potassium cyanide powders. A lot of times the powder is compressed into little blocks or pillows for safety reasons, basically to keep the powders contained and from spilling or blowing around. We talked about the odor. Remember, women can smell it better than men can. And they are highly toxic, especially to marine environments and fish kills. This is a big problem where gold mining happens. If they release the cyanide, it kills basically all the fish in the rivers. Let's go to the next slide. Here we have the 4 different cyanides of concern. You can see the uses: production of plastics, nylons, and other cyanide resins. We talked about productions of metals, refining ores, herbicides for plants, gold mining, electroplating, steel treatment. A lot of metal manufacturing and herbicides will use cyanides, as we can see here. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Here's some of the phosphorus compounds. Okay, you can see there's 4 on the list that are concerned. They are all toxic industrial chemicals, and they also can be used as chemical weapon precursors, specifically for manufacturing a lot of the nerve agents. You can see a lot of them are clear liquids. They don't look like much, or they're lightly, very pale yellow powders. Here you can see is a response to a truck that is actually leaking phosphorus trichloride. Notice the vapors on this are white, where chlorine, it was yellowish green. Okay, let's go to the next slide. The phosphorus compounds, they will be shipped in a lot of times in very large seagoing containers. Here you can see on the container, it has the UN number in a small orange box, also the diamond label to the hazards, and the names of the chemicals and who to call if there's a spill. These are used a lot in agricultural, flame retardants, hydraulic fluid additives, and quite a bit in semiconductor manufacturing. Here we have the 4 different phosphorus compounds that are also of concern. And all of these are also listed in the book as well. All right, let's go to the next slide. A little bit about some of acids. There's several acids that are very strong. There's fuming nitric acid. And when it's called fuming, when you actually open the container, it will have some vapors and fumes coming out of the top. Sulfuric acid, the picture on the top, you can see an individual who had sulfuric acid spilled. It got on his shirt, held it against his skin, and as you know, acid can cause very massive skin burns like you see in the picture. Someone that's been working with nitric acid, the picture on the bottom, nitric acid will turn your fingers yellow. Nitric acid can be used in manufacturing of homemade explosives. So individuals that would have these yellow stained fingers, it's a good chance that they were actually handling nitric acid without using gloves. Let's go to the next slide. Here we have fuming nitric acid. The picture on the bottom right is a beaker with the acid in it, and you can notice the way the fumes are coming out. Here we have a rail car on the bottom left containing sulfuric acid. Again, this sulfuric acid is used a lot for manufacturing of batteries that are used in cars, like we saw in the pictures yesterday. Also, nitric acid is used in explosives, in rocket fuels, and fertilizer manufacture. You can see the placarding that it's very dangerous. It's an oxidizer and corrosive. That's some of the typical placarding that you might see. All right, let's go to the next category. And we're going to talk a little bit about pesticides. So many pesticides are very similar to traditional chemical weapon agents, particularly the nerve agents. Pesticides are manufactured worldwide. They're in every single country. They're very important for the production of food crops to control bugs. There's over 2.5 billion kilograms of pesticides that are used around the world every year. So you can take a look at the different categories. You have herbicides, we have fungicides, we also have insecticides and the other categories. So insecticides is number 2. Herbicides is number 1 for killing unwanted plants. One of the problems with pesticides is their transportation and storage does not get near the same attention as some of the other categories of chemicals. I live in the very center of the United States, close to where a lot of corn and grain is grown. A lot of times as I'm driving out in the country, I can see on the side of the roads, farmers will place large containers of pesticides and herbicides right on the side of the road, where I could actually stop, open that container, and grab some of those chemicals. This is a big issue in the United States, and it could be over where you are as well. People just don't think of these as being that highly hazardous. Let's go to the next slide. Some of the common pesticides you can see listed here. The third one, malathion, is very common pesticide used in the US for controlling bugs, ants, mosquitoes, a lot of insects. These things are used for. You can see the picture of the individual's hands and feet in the upper right-hand picture. You notice the damage to their skin. This is caused by overexposure to pesticides. And they can have a lot of the same reactions on people as do nerve agents. So here we have lists of a lot of the common types of pesticides to keep an eye out for. Let's go to the next slide. So some of the uses for pesticides in agricultural use, home farming, I can go buy a lot of pesticides at the hardware store that I can use in my home garden to keep bugs off of tomatoes that I'm trying to grow. There's also commercial pest control, which are more toxic than what the individuals can buy. It's a higher concentration. Golf courses, they use lots of chemicals to keep the grass perfect and green. And then there's so many other uses for pesticides. They're used around food storage to keep insects out of food. Here we have some of the common pesticides listed down below. All right, let's go to the next slide. So that was a lot of information that we just covered. So remember, there's the classical chemical weapon agents that are the most toxic. If you are a terrorist group, these are going to be hard to get your hands on unless you manufacture them yourself. The precursor chemicals for manufacturing of the classic chemical weapons are somewhat easier to acquire, as we learned through the Shinrikyo, who acquired the precursor ingredients. Then we have the toxic industrial chemicals and agricultural chemicals that are much easier to get your hands on, and terrorist groups could gather these quite simply to cause a terrorist situation. So remember, the easiest way to identify chemicals, the very easiest is by the CAS number, by far. Next, we have the UN numbers, which are good numbers, and the HS system is also good, but a lot of those are more in categories. So if you have not done it already, I would recommend you download these files that Heidi had sent yesterday afternoon that contain these books, which I think you'll find very helpful. Does anyone have any questions before we go on break? All right, I think we are all ready for